a bit of forgetfulness, a few repeated stories, mild confusion about ordinary things. Neurodegenerative disease often starts with such small signs. Where it goes from there depends on many things. To help us understand that and explain some of the latest thinking on dementia, from diagnosis to treatment, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Sharon Cohen, behavioral neurologist and director of the Toronto Memory Program, a community-based multidisciplinary clinic. Welcome, Dr. Cohen.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I'm looking forward to this conversation because over the next hour, we're going to be using a lot of terms, and I've been using them all wrong. So tell us the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease.
Sure. This is a common question. Alzheimer's disease is a specific disease. It causes dementia. It has an underlying change in the brain that we can recognize at autopsy, and even in life it has a characteristic pattern. But it is just one of many causes of dementia. Dementia simply means that one has lost cognitive or thinking abilities to the degree that they can't function properly anymore. And that can be due to a stroke, a brain tumor, a head injury. It turns out that in seniors, Alzheimer's disease is the commonest cause. So dementia and Alzheimer's often are used equivalently because Alzheimer's is such a common cause of dementia.
But they're two different
things.
But
it's only one cause. And when someone has dementia, the next question should be, well, what's the cause? Because the care plan, the treatment plan, the medications may differ depending on the underlying cause.
We're going to get into more of that.
Sure.
But is this just a normal part of getting older?
Absolutely not. Used to be thought that, and we'd use these wastebasket terms like senility or what do you expect when grandma's 88. But just being old, even being 90 or 100, doesn't mean that you're going to have dementia or Alzheimer's disease. There are specific changes that go on in the brain that occur more often when you're older. So Alzheimer's is an age-related disease. Your risk of Alzheimer's increases as you get older, but it's not a given. In fact, most people don't have dementia in late life, although a surprisingly, alarmingly large number of people do. So that's why we have to take note of this disease.
So is it hereditary then?
There is a hereditary component. The very strongly inherited Alzheimer's disease occurs in only about 1% to 2% of all of the families in the world with Alzheimer's disease. So for most people with the disease, there are risk factor genes, there are other factors, maybe protective factors, and there's a balance between risk and protection, with some of it being genetic. But for the most part, it's only a very small percentage who have gene mutations, abnormal genes that run through the family.
Let's get into some numbers.
Sure.
Because of the numbers associated with dementia, over 500,000 Canadians of 564,000 are currently living with dementia. By 2031, this number will rise to 937,000. That is an increase of 66%.
Yes.
It's astounding.
Yes.
How is this evolving into a public health issue?
It is actually already a public health crisis, and the World Health Organization
You call it a crisis?
It is a crisis. Alzheimer's disease is a pandemic, which is worse than an epidemic, and the World Health Organization has recognized this a few years ago, that it is an urgent healthcare priority. And whatever level you come at it, from personal suffering and family chaos and loss of self for the individual, or from the financial, what is it going to do to society? It's going to break the bank in healthcare. So we can't ignore it. The numbers are staggering, and they are growing. And they're growing largely because of the demographic in Canada and around the world, where we have more seniors than grandchildren now. We have the baby boomers turning 60 plus at an alarming rate, and that's the bulge in the demographic. So we have more and more people entering the age at which Alzheimer's becomes more likely.
As a parent, I'm curious to know, people are having kids later in life too, so how is that going to be impacted if you're an older parent with younger children?
Well, that's interesting. There are fewer children in families, and if one develops Alzheimer's disease, the most common caregivers are family members. So if you don't have as many children, then you don't have as much of a support network. If your children are older, they may be better capable of looking after you, but if you are having your children when you are older, then you've got younger children who may be still in high school, university, attending to their own career. When your time comes, if
it's going
comes.
to create another layer of what are some of the signs and symptoms of the disease that people should be aware of?
Well, you mentioned in the beginning forgetfulness, forgetting little things, and that's often how the disease begins. And so it's so easy to just brush that off as being absent-minded, being distracted, being overworked, not having slept well, or just being 60, 65, 70. Memory's not going to be perfect. But over time, if Alzheimer's disease is brewing, that very mild forgetfulness becomes much more substantial forgetfulness. You're not just repeating a story occasionally, thinking that you haven't told it for the first time. You know, when the disease is more advanced, you're forgetting whether you're married, how many children you had, where you live. Very substantial loss in memory, not just recent events, but your whole biography. So it's a real threat to your identity and very challenging for others to manage your care. And it's not just a condition that affects memory. So Alzheimer's disease is not just forgetfulness. It impacts communication ability, so language, being able to find one's way around, navigate in space, being able to reason, make good judgments and decisions, being able to use tools like the TV remote and the telephone. So it's a much broader condition than just normal aging where there's a bit of forgetfulness that we can still function well with.
So how can you tell the difference between Alzheimer's and senility?
Yeah, so we don't really use the term senility anymore, but age-related memory change is mild. In the early phases of Alzheimer's, the symptoms may be exactly the same. So somebody needs to see a specialist, go to a memory clinic, see someone like myself, and have cognitive testing done. And that may, by itself, give us the answer of, this is the amount of forgetfulness we'd put down to age alone, or this is more than what we would put down to age alone. And then there are other investigations we would do, scans, blood work, to try and investigate what the cause might be of the forgetfulness, because it's not all Alzheimer's disease. If we're thinking Alzheimer's disease, then there are some special scans and other fancy things that can be done. So people really, I guess the take-home message is people shouldn't ignore their forgetfulness. They should have it checked out.
Is it true that in the past, in order to diagnose with someone with Alzheimer's, you had to do like a scan of the brain, like during an autopsy?
Well, what used to be taught was the only way you could be 100% sure that someone had Alzheimer's disease in life is after they died, you would section their brain, look under the microscope, and the pathologist would say, yes, there are the plaques, there are the tangles, they are in abundant supply, and this brain fits with the pathologic criteria for Alzheimer's. That doesn't help the person who's passed away already. It might give some information to the family, some confirmation of what they suspected. But really, if we're going to make headway with this disease, we need to diagnose much earlier. And even though we won't have the pathologist's confidence and use the pathology criteria, there are clinical criteria, so people in life now can be pretty sure about a diagnosis. And there's, in the last few years, the advent of special tracers we use in PET scans that can actually see the plaque building up, amyloid plaque. Amyloid's one of the earliest changes we can see in Alzheimer's disease, and we can see this even before symptoms are substantial. So we don't wait till autopsy. If someone wants to have an investigation early on, depending on the situation, a PET amyloid scan might give us a very good idea that that person's on the path to Alzheimer's.
Does early diagnosis make a difference?
We think it does, for many reasons. Well, knowledge is empowering. You wouldn't ignore the early signs of breast cancer, but in the past, we used to not even tell people they had a diagnosis of cancer because why upset people if you don't have treatment?
Imagine.
So the argument now is, well, if we don't have a treatment or a cure for Alzheimer's disease, why would you scare someone with that worrisome diagnosis? But knowledge is empowering. People can make decisions about how they want their life to proceed. When you diagnose early, people can be actively involved in the decision-making. When you diagnose someone late, their capacity for decision-making may really be impacted, and they're no longer an active player, which seems so unfair. You've robbed them of the opportunity to say, I want this, I don't want that. There are also medicines that treat symptoms, and even though these are not as powerful as we would like, they don't reverse the disease, they do offer some benefit, and people are better off treated than untreated. And then there are clinical trials trying new medicines that are very exciting, that may be able to stabilize disease and remove plaque from the brain. So there are lots of things people can do, and there are lots of support services that people can have access to. But without a diagnosis, you don't know. you think, oh, you're just being lazy. Other people kind of don't treat you as very capable. And you may get fired from your job as opposed to your physician making a diagnosis, filling out a disability, long-term disability form, and putting you in better shape financially to weather the storm.
Can you then reverse the cognitive loss after a diagnosis?
So we can't reverse the cognitive loss. The medicines we have sometimes improve symptoms, so memory test scores may improve, but the underlying accumulation of plaques and tangles, other proteins in the brain that damage the brain, progresses relentlessly. And the new era of treatments that are under study now in research are to try and do something about this relentless progression of the disease, to stabilize it or to reverse it. And if we start very early in people who don't have symptoms, the hope is that we can cure them. So these people will never go on to develop symptoms. So that is something to stay tuned for. That's very much actively involved. And anybody who feels they're at risk for Alzheimer's, maybe family member with the disease and maybe a little bit of forgetfulness, should get this checked out. They may have some real opportunities to help.
When you say stabilized, do you mean that it slows down the symptoms?
Yes, or keep them from progressing. Yeah, keep them stable.
And if you find, if you're a person with a genetic marker, what then?
So genetic markers can come in two types. There can be a risk marker. ApoE4 is a gene that we are very interested in. We all carry ApoE. And it comes in different types, and the ApoE4 type confers a little bit higher risk of developing Alzheimer's. And there are treatment studies now for people in this higher risk group, and they don't have to have any substantial memory symptoms. They may be cognitively normal, but at this higher risk with the ApoE. So then there are things that can be done that hopefully will keep healthy people healthy. If someone has a gene mutation, so we talked about these rare families where there's actually an abnormal gene inherited that by itself is enough to cause Alzheimer's disease. If we catch this early, before the person has dementia, and we know they are going to go on to develop Alzheimer's disease, they have the gene already, there are treatment studies also going on for them to lower amyloid plaque and other kinds of interventions, hopefully to prevent them from ever developing symptoms.
But you have to catch it early, right?
Catching early is pretty important, yeah. So whether it's caring for people better who have symptoms or preventing people from developing symptoms, the earlier the better.
Okay. This summer, the British medical journal, The Lancet, published a study that suggested a third of dementia cases could be mitigated or perhaps even prevented by lifestyle changes in these key ways. And they are education, hearing loss, exercise and physical activity, diabetes, hypertension and obesity, smoking, depression, social contact, and head injuries. I'd like to unpack this a little bit. How would education relate to dementia later in life?
Okay, it's an interesting risk factor. People who have lower levels of education are represented as having a greater risk for dementia, and we think this is because they haven't built up the same cognitive reserve. And what I mean by the cognitive reserve is more connections amongst brain cells. We have 100 billion brain cells, and each brain cell could have hundreds to thousands of connections with other brain cells. And if you pursue education, especially higher education or longer education, lifelong education, you are building more connections between brain cells. So you have a brain that is better able to withstand the ravages of brain disease, a disease like Alzheimer's disease, because you're starting with a much healthier, more resilient brain. And that's probably the way that education protects us.
So Sudoku actually works? All those puzzles?
Yeah, so I think, lifelong learning is good. The studies that The Lancet reported on are more early life education, so people who go on past high school to pursue education are relatively protected against Alzheimer's. But we know that this is a relative thing because there are many fine intellects, authors, and artists and politicians who were not short of education who developed Alzheimer's disease. So yes, we think part of a brain healthy lifestyle is to stay mentally active through not just through early education, later in life as well. Use your brain, but it's not a guarantee.
And what about hearing loss?
And hearing loss, this one's a little bit more controversial in terms of whether there's a cause or effect. But certainly when one loses hearing, and that is common later in life, coexisting with a common disease like Alzheimer's disease later in life, hearing loss can compound the problems that that compromised Alzheimer's brain is facing. If you're having trouble remembering or understanding information because of Alzheimer's, and then you're not hearing all the information because of hearing impairment, it just makes it even harder to make sense of what you're hearing and hold on to the details. But also, hearing loss tends to make people withdraw somewhat from social situations, and social isolation is part and parcel of early Alzheimer's symptoms, and also can be a consequence of developing memory problems. People feel less comfortable joining in conversation. So these are sort of a cyclical group of symptoms that not strictly cause and effect, but they compound each other. They're at least additive, if not synergistic. More reasons to avoid conversation and socializing, and that in turn may be negative for the brain, because part of building that healthy brain network involves social interaction, not just education.
It seems as if exercise, physical activity, diabetes, hypertension, and obesity could all be grouped together, right? How do these factors affect the brain?
They're all very interesting, and maybe the exercise story is the most recent and startling of all of them. We've known for a long time that midlife hypertension is very important to control to protect the brain. And exercise is part of helping the heart and the blood vessels be healthy and good blood supply to the brain. But exercise also boosts a chemical in the brain. It's got a fancy name, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. I won't make you say that. But it is a very important chemical that is enhanced by exercise. And what it does is it helps brain cells recover from injury. So not every injured brain cell has to die. Brain cells could recover. It also helps them sprout new connections and helps new brain cells grow. So you actually can grow new brain cells. That's not what I was taught in medical school, but that is in fact true. And in the hippocampus, which is this very specialized memory area of the brain, that's where we can grow new brain cells in particular. So
I didn't know that.
Exercise, and you don't, unlike an elite athlete who has to gear exercise training to a particular sport, whether it's endurance or weight training, here you can dance, do Tai Chi, yoga, garden, whatever you like. And you're probably boosting,
Forget the body, it's good for your brain.
That's right, or it's an added benefit. Exercise is good for a lot of aspects of the body. The problem with exercise is it's hard to know from the studies we have what's the right dose, what's the right amount, what's the ideal recipe. So we encourage people to stay physically active, don't be a couch potato, but we can't be too dogmatic about the dose of exercise.
And what about smoking?
And smoking. Well, smoking is a bad actor in a few ways. Okay, so smoking's hard on the blood vessels, and you do need blood supply to the brain. So those small blood vessels in the brain are affected by smoking. Atherosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries, is affected in the brain as it is in the heart. Smoking affects the heart, so you don't get a good pumping of blood to the brain, and the smoking puts you at risk for stroke. But on top of that, there are a lot of toxic chemicals in smoke that may add to the injury to the brain, and that's another avenue in which the smoking may affect cognition.
We already touched on depression and social contact being necessary. Finally, is there a correlation between head injuries and dementia?
There certainly is, and it's a complicated one. So there are some head injuries that can cause dementia. You're hit by a bus, you have a substantial brain injury, and you can't think right after that. Okay, so it's a sudden onset of dementia. It's not Alzheimer's disease, different type of dementia. But there are these mild head injuries or concussions that can also cumulatively cause dementia. And they can do that in two ways. They can cause a dementia of a particular type called CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which we hear about in the footballers and the soccer players, and more and more in the media about that. Repeated head injury seems to cause a certain protein, tau, more than amyloid, tau, to develop in the brain and become a progressive degenerative disease affecting thinking and behavior. But the injured brain from a substantial head injury or concussions can also move forward the development of Alzheimer's disease in someone who is destined to develop the disease 5 to 10 years earlier, they may start showing signs of Alzheimer's disease. So it's very complicated, but not beyond what we should be talking about. So yeah, protect your head, wear a helmet, don't fall off your bike.
No smoking.
No smoking.
Dr. Cohen.
Sound like the police.
I know. Oh, they're like strict parent, but it's necessary. Dr. Cohen, thank you for helping us understand Alzheimer's disease.
You're so welcome.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.